So before I actually get into the meat of this video and actually show you any gameplay of this, I need to give you a photosensitivity warning for those of you out there who have any kind of issues with photosensitivity, like epilepsy or anything like that. Then you will want to avoid Marathon like the plague. Because I'm not photosensitive, and yet the game gives me splitting headaches with all of the cutscenes and the menu transitions and such like that because of the sheer number of bright flashing lights as well as the bright neon color scheme that they've decided to go with on this thing. Now, it's not quite as bad during regular gameplay, but it can still be pretty rough during that, so I would recommend that if you have any kind of issues with photosensitivity at all, just avoid Marathon entirely. Or at least avoid this Marathon, the 2026 one. You can play the originals all you want, they don't have any of that kind of problem. But Marathon 2026 is an assault upon the senses, so I would highly recommend that if you have any kind of issues with photosensitivity, avoid it like the plague. So for anybody out there who has issues with photosensitivity, go ahead and just stop watching the video now. Understand that this is definitely not the game for you. As for the viewers who will be sticking around throughout the rest of this video, I'm going to go ahead and just mention that from here on out, I am not going to refer to this as Marathon 2026 because that is going to get very tiresome very quickly. So instead, to differentiate it from the original Marathon, I'm going to refer to it as New Marathon, NU Marathon. Kind of like how you'll see the Doom reboot being referred to as New Doom or something along those lines. Now then, with all those notes out of the way, what is New Marathon? Well, it is Bungie's attempt at an extraction shooter. Now, for those of you who may not know what an extraction shooter is, because it is ultimately a pretty niche genre, the idea is that it is generally a PvEvP experience, so player versus environment versus player, where not only are you going to be fighting against the computer-controlled opponents, but you're also potentially going to be fighting against other players. You don't necessarily have to do this, however. If you're playing a game that's more on the, say, Escape from Tarkov side of the spectrum, you might actually find yourself working with other players much more commonly than you would think, and that is because in games like that, there is a heavier emphasis on completing personal objectives and finding loot, rather than simply going up against other players. In a game like Hunt Showdown, on the other hand, where there's not really all that much loot to speak of, and the primary objective is to hunt down a specific monster on the map, take down that monster, and then extract with one of the very limited number of bounty tokens it drops, you're inevitably going to come into conflict with other players, and it's going to be a lot more PvP focused. Regardless of where on the spectrum the game is falling, the general gameplay experience is going to be very similar. You're going to jump into the map, you're going to have whatever equipment you bring in with you, and then as you're wandering around the map, you'll find loot scattered around, whether it be things like weapons or ammunition or various tools or simply items that you can use to construct things or whatever it may well be. There will be computer-controlled opponents of some sort that you'll have to either avoid or directly engage, and there will be various tasks or quests or contracts or whatever the game is referring to them as that you can complete in order to get additional bonuses if you successfully extract. This is where the whole extraction idea comes in. Once you've completed your objectives, fought whatever you felt like fighting or had to fight on your way around the map, gotten whatever loot you can get your grubby hands on, then you go to some sort of exfil or extraction point on the map, activate that extraction point, and then you have to wait a certain amount of time, depending on the extraction point, depending on the game obviously, in order to successfully extract from the map. If you fail to do this at any point, whether that be because another player drops you, or the AI-controlled opponents drop you, or you simply don't make it to the extraction point in time, then you lose whatever you were carrying. All your weapons, all your loot, all of it is just lost. The idea behind this is that it creates a high-intensity gameplay loop where you have some real stakes for whether you win or lose. Because again, you don't necessarily need to beat all of the other players in order to successfully extract. Sometimes you can just kind of sneak your way out. But there's always that tension, the idea that you might lose this really cool piece of loot that you found, or you might have to try to repeat the objectives that you had just completed over again if it's a particular quest that requires you to do it all in one run and then extract successfully. And when this gameplay loop is firing on all cylinders, it is basically a roller coaster of incredible highs and crushing depths, where in one run you might just get sniped from across the map almost immediately and lose whatever equipment you brought in and just get frustrated beyond belief. And then in another run, you might go in, you find some incredible loot, and you get into some really hairy fights along the way, and you barely manage to extract by the skin of your teeth, thus securing all of that valuable loot you got and managing to keep your equipment for at least another run. And that kind of thing can be downright exhilarating. It is, however, an experience that is way more niche than Bungie probably thought it was. They seem to be under the impression that extraction shooters are the next big evolution in first-person shooter gaming. And I'm really not sure how they came to that conclusion, because while games like, say, Escape from Tarkov and Hunt Showdown have found success, they haven't reached the kind of success that you would expect from, say, a AAA first-person shooter like Bungie is known to make. And something that you will find very quickly if you look into these established extraction shooters is that you can't really play them casually. I mean, sure, you can try to play them casually, but if you don't try to keep up with the meta, then you're going to be at a significant disadvantage compared to all of the other players. In some of the games like this, that's not as much of a problem. For example, something like Hunt Showdown, you can be effective with basically any gear that's available in the game. Meanwhile, in the case of something like Escape from Tarkov, if you're not running gear that is capable of dealing with high-tier meta, so for example, rounds that are capable of penetrating armor at higher levels, or of course armors at higher levels to allow you to survive more of those kinds of rounds, then you are at a massive disadvantage compared to anybody who is running that kind of thing. This disadvantage can be mitigated by skill and luck. You might get a really lucky or just well-placed headshot that will drop an enemy instantly instead of having to go through all of their armor first, but that's of course a lot easier said than done. If you're getting to the point where you're having to deal with the high-tier meta, most of the time you are just absolutely screwed. To make matters worse, a lot of these kinds of games have what are called wipes, where when major updates are pushed, or it's the start of a new season or something like that, everyone loses all of their gear, and most likely any progress made on their character or characters, depending on what kind of game it is, so that when you boot the game back up after one of these wipes, it's basically like starting the entire game all over again. This kind of gameplay experience is completely alienating to your average first-person shooter player. They have absolutely no interest in keeping up with the meta. They have absolutely no interest in losing progress, whether on an individual match basis or on an overall account basis in the case of something like a wipe. They just want to boot up their game and hop into a few matches. They want to progress at their own pace and never lose access to the stuff that they've unlocked. Now, the style of gameplay presented in an extraction shooter is effectively anathema to the casual shooter audience. It really only appeals in large part to the hardcore competitive side of the first-person shooter audience. The kinds of people who will spend hundreds upon hundreds, potentially even thousands of hours into one specific game. And that's fine in and of itself. It's a niche style of gameplay for a niche of the first-person shooter market. There's nothing inherently wrong with that as long as you are managing your expectations about how many players are going to be retained and what budget is going into producing the game in the first place. And considering that Sony has filed an impairment loss of about $750 million with a B as in Bravo, US dollars against Bungie, it is abundantly clear that what Bungie has been doing is anything but managing expectations and managing their budgets. Now, what it seems like they've been doing instead is deliberately going out of their way to alienate as much of their potential audience as they possibly could. Oh sure, it's bad enough that they spent over $250 million developing a game that will only appeal to a very small niche of the first-person shooter audience to begin with. But then they had to go and make things worse. They also alienated pretty much the entire existing Marathon fanbase, because the existing Marathon fanbase wants a single-player, story-driven first-person shooter, not a multiplayer-only, primarily PvP extraction shooter. On top of that, this game looks and sounds absolutely nothing like the original Marathon games. You see, the original Marathon games had a sort of military sci-fi aesthetic going on, and that aesthetic would actually develop into what everyone knows now as Halo. If you look at Halo and compare it to the original Marathon games, you can see the very clear progression from Marathon into Halo in terms of art style. Halo is the true successor of Marathon in terms of art style, whereas New Marathon's aesthetic, if you can even really call it that, is more along the lines of what I would describe as cyberpunk, although describing it as cyberpunk is not going to really work there, because when you think of cyberpunk, you'll think of things like Blade Runner or Cyberpunk 2020 or Cyberpunk 2077 or things like that. You're not going to think of every single character design being absolutely hideous and all of the environments and the characters and the gear and everything looking like it's not actually finished because they just slapped so many discordant colors and bright neon colors and bright lights on everything to the point where it legitimately hurts to look at it. In fact, the only things that really tie this to the original game are that it is set on the Tau Ceti 4 colony and that it makes a few references to things that were in the original Marathon games, like the infamous line, "Somewhere in the heavens they are waiting," as well as, of course, referencing the colony ship, the Marathon, among a few other things. But that's it. It's just references. There aren't any 4 running around that you encounter. The only NPCs you'll run into in this game are hostile UESC robots and wildlife. Everything else is just another player, just another so-called runner that is just a consciousness uploaded into basically a robotic shell. In other words, this is mostly a Marathon game in name only. They basically just took the franchise out of deep freeze in order to reuse the name for something that has almost nothing to do with the original games, thus alienating those fans of the original games. Obviously nothing really new for the gaming industry as a whole, but it was new to Bungie at least. Then something that unfortunately wasn't new to Bungie caused even further alienation, which was the whole plagiarism debacle, where they had just taken an artist's work and started using it without permission, and then they had to later publicly apologize for it and reach some sort of settlement with the artist. And again, that's not even the first time they've done it. It's not even the second time. It's more like the 4th. So yeah, that definitely alienated more people, and then there was even more alienation when they went and announced that Destiny 2's live service support is ending, and that there are currently no plans for a Destiny 3 or a Destiny spin-off game or anything of the sort. It's just, they're going to end Destiny 2 and put everything on New Marathon. To say this was idiotic is a severe understatement. They basically alienated their entire existing fan base, because Destiny 2 players, by and large, don't mess around with PvP at all. They're almost exclusively PvE players, which of course means that they want absolutely nothing to do with New Marathon. It is something that doesn't remotely appeal to them. And you're killing off the game that they're actively playing and probably actively spending money on for cosmetics and such, so that you can just put all of your resources into working on the game they want nothing to do with. So now they've alienated that entire fan base, and not only that, but they've made a large portion of them angry. So now there's a hostile mob of former Destiny players, among other things, that are deliberately trying to make Marathon fail. And if you were someone who somehow wasn't alienated by all of those things, when you get into the game, there's even more stuff to alienate you. I already mentioned how awful the art style is in this game, but it's much worse in the menus. When you're trying to navigate the menus in this game, they just don't make a whole lot of sense. It's described as font slop, because there are just constant changes in font for no discernible reason. Absolutely nothing is organized in any kind of intuitive manner. There's a lot of wasted space. It is hideous to look at, and simply trying to navigate it is confusing at best. To make matters worse, when you're trying to figure out what the various items in your inventory are, well, good luck. You're gonna need it, because so many of them are just small box-like objects that look pretty much the same as one another. So you're gonna have to just constantly hover over objects in your inventory to figure out what the hell they are with the pop-up that comes up. And I'm sorry, I can put up with an awful lot when it comes to art design in video games. I firmly believe that visuals are not inherently a problem unless they actively interfere with your ability to play the game, and New Marathon's visuals absolutely interfere with your ability to play the game. And if you can somehow push through all of that and get into the meat of the gameplay experience, you find that it is just a mess. The new player experience is absolutely abysmal, even after they've made some changes to the UI since launch, and they've also introduced the so-called beginner solo mode, which is sort of an attempt at a semi-PvE mode. There are other players there, but weirdly enough, you almost never actually run into them. You can go through the entire match and never run into a single player, which is really weird for a game like this. And you find out very quickly that when you're wandering around the map, basically nothing is happening. There's very few enemies that you'll run into except at very specific points on the map, and most of your time is just going to be spent traversing the area without really knowing where you're going, what you're doing, or why you're doing it. It's almost impossible to tell at a glance what objects in the environment you can actually interact with, and you're limited to only one active contract at a time. So you're not going to have very many objectives to complete in any given run. Contrast that with something like, say, Escape from Tarkov, where you get tasks from the various traders and you can get a whole bunch of them all on the same map, so you can spend pretty much the entire time going around and completing those various objectives and have plenty to do. You'll also be running into a lot of AI-controlled scabs, and you'll be running into other players, so you'll be getting into firefights, you'll be trying to avoid firefights and try to sneak away from things, you'll be trying to complete objectives. There's all kinds of stuff to be doing in a game like that, but in Bungie's new marathon, there's barely anything going on, so what you do find is that players will seek out each other simply to have something to do, and that something to do is basically just deathmatch. But unlike in games that actually do deathmatch well, where they just give you all the various weapons scattered around the map, this is an extraction shooter, so you have whatever gear you bring in, and if you're coming in with barely anything because you're a new player and you're using one of the kits the game provides for you, you'll find that you are severely outmatched when you're going up against somebody who's had some time to gear up, and thus just simply has more shields than you do, has better ways of repairing those shields and replenishing their health than you do, and has weapons that do more damage than yours, so they can drop you almost instantly, but you're sitting there wailing on them round after round, dumping basically entire magazines into them, and they're still standing like you're just mildly inconveniencing them. And in a game like this, that raw numbers advantage you get from simply having better gear, better implants, a more leveled up character, that kind of thing, is a true obstacle to being able to get much of anything out of PvP in this thing, because it's not like you can really compensate for that with skill. Sure, if you're a better shot, then you'll be able to land more hits, but that doesn't really matter all that much when the damage numbers that you are outputting are not sufficient to overcome their defenses before they're able to put you down. So the way you can actually at least try to overcome that gap is to either ambush enemies and thus take them by surprise and get a few shots in before they're able to really do anything about it, or to simply gang up on other players with up to 2 squad mates. But of course the latter either requires you to have friends playing the game with you, or rely on matchmaking to place you with up to 2 randos that may or may not be useful. And the game is clearly meant to be played in squads, by the way, because there is a down but not out mechanic where if an enemy drops you, you're placed into a state where you can be revived by one of your teammates, and that occurs even if you're playing solo, so it's abundantly clear they put basically no effort into the solo experience whatsoever, and intend for you to be playing either in duos or trios, only for some utterly baffling reason, the only ones I could select in the matchmaking were either solos or trios. For whatever reason, it was locking the ability to select duos. I have absolutely no idea why Bungie decided to do that, but for whatever reason, they decided to do that. So I only had the option to play as either a solo or a trio, and if I was playing as a trio, I could select whether to autofill my party with randos, or to simply play it solo. And I absolutely despise playing with randos on my team in a game like this, so I played the entire thing solo. And it didn't make any difference, because I don't think I ran into a single group of players when I was going through this thing at all. I would run into individual players a few times, sure, but groups of them actually working together? No. So I don't really know what was going on with the matchmaking there, but suffice to say, the idea of trying to gang up on other players to overcome the numerical disadvantage clearly did not apply to me during this entire experience, either going up against it or even just doing it myself. So, let's just say your mileage may vary on that kind of thing. So that leaves only one other real option there, and that is just to ambush other players, and that requires you to play in a manner that is really obnoxious. because the maps in this game are fairly large, and players are so spread out that if you don't actively try to seek other players out, you probably won't run into them. So about the only place you can actually set up some sort of ambush position is at the exfil point. And anybody who's played extraction shooters before knows that exfil point campers are just the worst. So if you're going with ambush tactics at the exfil point in an attempt to overcome the gear disadvantage, the game basically just forces you to play like an asshole, and that is not fun for anybody involved. It's not fun for the player for the most part, it's not fun for anybody you're playing against, it's just annoying. So really you either have to simply try to avoid other players so that you don't run afoul of the gear disadvantage, or you just kinda have to get lucky in firefights. And to put it simply, that's not fun. The vast majority of the gameplay experience here is incredibly boring, just wandering around a map that has basically nothing to do in it, and then for the fleeting moments where you actually are doing something, most of the time you're just either picking up an item or interacting with a terminal or something of the sort, and then you're done. You've completed the contract, and it's time to get out of there, so you head to the exfil point, you activate it, you wait for it to become active, you stand in the exfil point for 10 seconds, and then it extracts you, and congratulations, you've survived the run. And if your experience is like mine for the vast majority of time you were playing this thing, you're probably not running into any other players at all, and even if you are running into them, then it's a luck of the draw situation as to whether they are as poorly geared as you are, or if they simply have way better gear than you do, and you stand absolutely no chance against them. And to put it very simply, the entire experience thereof is not fun. It doesn't really have those highs and lows that you would really expect from an extraction shooter. Instead, it's just boring, a constant stream of boredom with the occasional fleeting moment of, well, there's at least something to do at this point that you frankly don't really care about. There's nothing to hook the player and keep them playing it like there is with other extraction shooters. It is no wonder the player base for this game has cratered as quickly as it has when you look at the experience and find that it is just incredibly lacking comparing to every single other extraction shooter. I mean, even Call of Duty's DMZ mode is more interesting than this, and the DMZ mode was basically a throwaway. The sad reality is that even if Bungie hadn't already alienated pretty much everybody who could have even slightly been interested in playing this thing, well before the game had even launched, the actual gameplay experience on offer here is what doomed this thing from the beginning. You see, there is a huge amount of competition in the first-person shooter space, with a huge variety of experiences available, and in the extraction shooter space in particular, you are dealing with games that, by their very nature, encourage entrenchment. Because they all require significant time and energy investment, you are going to pick one or two games and you are going to stick with them. And it is going to take an extremely impressive game to pull you away from those games you've already established as your extraction shooters. And the sad and simple reality is that New Marathon does not offer anything that will actually pull players away from those other titles. All it really has going for it is gunplay that's, I guess, kinda decent if you're a console FPS fan, but even then, it's largely ruined by the statistical differences between players who have geared up versus players who haven't. So that potential advantage is rendered completely moot, and without that, it just doesn't really have anything to offer that would make it worth putting your time and money into. I mean, hell, the game was available for free over the past week, and even that wasn't enough to persuade people to stick around with this thing. They tried it out and they're like, wow, this sucks, and then they just move on with their lives. And as much as New Marathon fans will endlessly shriek about how people shouldn't talk about player counts, and that the so-called chuds are out in force just trying to make New Marathon fail, and all the YouTubers and such criticizing the game are all just grifters who are doing it for clicks and monetization, the simple reality here is that Bungie made a game that fits into a very small niche of players in the first-person shooter space to begin with, did absolutely nothing to make it an appealing enough experience experience to draw people away from other extraction shooters long term, did basically nothing to address numerous flaws that have been in the extraction shooter genre for a very long time, in which most other examples of the genre have found ways to mitigate, massively overbloated their budget, and thus ultimately created the expectation of absolutely ludicrous numbers of players to simply break even, and then proceeded to alienate as much of their audience as they possibly could through their own dumb and antagonistic decisions. And now they sit here practically begging people to buy the game when there's really no reason to. This doesn't offer an experience that I can recommend to anybody. If you're a fan of extraction shooters, you already have extraction shooters that you're playing and probably still enjoying. Most likely either Escape from Tarkov, Hunt Showdown, or Arc Raiders, or maybe even a combination thereof. And if you're not already a fan of extraction shooters, then I would say the best way to kind of test the waters is actually just to play the Call of Duty DMZ mode. I mean, after all, it's completely free. It's part of Call of Duty Warzone, so anybody can download it and mess around with it. And compared to all the other extraction shooters on the market, it's pretty low stakes, so it's fairly easy to jump in and out of, get an idea if you like the general gameplay style. And if you do end up enjoying that gameplay style, then there are plenty of well-established extraction shooters that you can hop right into. And if you end up not liking the general gameplay style presented in the DMZ mode of Call of Duty, then chances are the extraction shooter genre simply isn't for you. So I guess to summarize everything here, if you've never played an extraction shooter before, then New Marathon is a terrible place to start. You would be much better served just trying out the DMZ mode of Call of Duty Warzone first, just to get an idea if you like that general gameplay style, and then from there, you can look into the more well-established extraction shooters, because those are going to offer considerably more engaging experiences than what New Marathon has to offer, which is seizure-inducing visuals, absolutely hideous art design, font slop, and a gameplay experience that is simply boring, and they are charging $40 US for this so-called privilege. Please, viewers, do yourself a favor. Don't bother with this game. It's not worth the time or money. There are so many other games out there that are worth your time and money. So if you're going to spend $40 US on a game, or even if you were looking at this game on sale, just spend that money on something else that will actually make you happy, instead of this utter slop mess of a game. Thank you all very much for watching and bearing with me while I rambled and ranted about this thing throughout the video. I know it was probably not what you were expecting from my channel. Normally I try to keep things more, what is the game doing, but New Marathon brings so little to the table that there's barely anything to talk about in terms of the actual gameplay experience. All the really interesting stuff is in how poorly this game was managed right from the beginning, and how it continues to be poorly managed, and how it will be yet another high-profile failure in Sony's lineup. It may not be anywhere near as catastrophic of a failure as, say, Concord, which didn't even last 2 weeks, but it's still a massive failure of a game, and I have a feeling that it's going to serve as a case study for future development, where people are going to look at it and be like, okay, what went wrong here, and how can we avoid it in the future? At least I hope it serves as a case study for that, because that's about all it's really good for. Now then, I need to wrap this up, because I've been rambling for too long at this point, so thank you all very much again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.